This one goes out to all of my fellow people pleasers. If you're tired of feeling guilty every time you say no, or maybe saying no is a foreign concept to you, and you want to advocate for yourself better, but you just don't know where to start, this episode is for you. We're going to be diving into the root of people pleasing so you can understand why and how you got here to begin with, because spoiler alert, you weren't born as a people pleaser. And more importantly, what can you do about it? All right, let's dive right in. Let's talk about the root of people pleasing. How do you end up as someone who struggles to say no? How do you end up as someone who feels guilty for putting themselves first? Or maybe you're someone who has said, that's just how I am. I've always been this way. No, you haven't. People pleasing is a trauma response and a coping mechanism. And when I say trauma response, I feel like every time I use that word trauma, I have to explain what I mean by that. Because if you're not trauma informed, or if this is your first experience really diving into this kind of stuff, it's easy to assume that trauma is a horrific thing that happens to unfortunate people, right? Like car accidents and death and war and these big traumatic events. But much, much more common is little trauma or little t trauma. And every single one of us experiences little t trauma. And that is not what happens to us, but rather the meaning we create by what happens to us. It is the fallout, the cause and effect of what happens to us. So I'm about to go through some common causes of people pleasing. It's not because of your parents. It's not because someone rejected you. It's not because of what happened. It's your response to the interaction you had with your parents. It's your response to feeling rejected. So as we go through these, I want you to notice how so much of this really has to do with our interpretation, our belief, and our meaning. The good news is if it isn't what happened to us and it's simply the meaning we're creating, it means we have the power to do something about it. Because gosh, if we didn't have a choice, if trauma just happened to be what happened to us, well, there's nothing that we can do to undo that, can we? Like, we can't change the past. We can't undo what happened. What we can do is learn how to develop self-awareness and shift our mindset, shift our perspective, learn cognitive skills to look at these things differently, learn how to redirect our thoughts, learn how to challenge our thoughts and our beliefs. And these are all things that, as a recovering people pleaser, will help you move out of your people-pleasing tendencies to a place where you start to feel more confident and more aligned in the choices you actually do want to make. Because a lot of the times, if you are a people pleaser, it's like you want to say no. The desire is there. You want to advocate for yourself, but you just don't know how, or that emotion is so strong, that guilt is unbearable. And so really learning how to heal people pleasing is learning how to manage those trigger reactions and those trauma responses, those coping mechanisms that were birthed out of trying to protect you, that were birthed out of trying to gain that acceptance. Let's go right into the most common roots and causes of people pleasing. The first one has everything to do with your childhood. There's a reason that "tell me about your childhood" is the first question that your therapist asks you. And it's because so much of how we see the world, how we view the world, our interactions with the world was formed during those first years of life, during those very formative years for us. As a child, if you were taught and if you were raised in a family that believed that children were meant to be seen and not heard, or if you had a father figure who was emotionally unavailable and was unable to tolerate any feelings of emotion, right? Like if you were raised with very disciplinarian, authoritative parental figures who didn't have any tolerance for emotion, it makes so much sense that as a child, you would start to adopt the belief that my feelings don't matter. Priority number one is always going to be maintaining our attachment to our parents, regardless if they're the most horrific, traumatic parents on the face of the universe. As children, it's like ingrained in our DNA to seek out that attachment. And our subconscious is so smart, so intelligent at figuring out ways to secure that attachment, or at least attempting to. And the most common way, if you grew up in any version of this, it doesn't have to be super intense, like I said. And you know what? This is also a really good time to point out that you didn't have to have awful parents for you to still experience childhood trauma. And I'm going to repeat that one again. You did not have to grow up with awful parents. You very well could have had a great childhood and still have experienced childhood trauma. And the reason I feel the need to emphasize that is because so often I encounter people who are like, well, I just don't understand why I'm like this. Like everyone says it's childhood trauma, but like, I don't get it. I had a great childhood. My parents were great. Yes, absolutely. But just because we have well-meaning parents and we have so many positive memories doesn't mean that it's black or white like that. It can be the and both. Our parents can have wonderful intentions and do the best that they can and do far better than, the average parent or whatever kind of scale you want to use. But that doesn't mean there weren't moments where they weren't able to be there for you to meet your needs. That doesn't mean there weren't moments of disconnect or moments that cause these small underlying beliefs. And oftentimes they are so small, they are so minuscule that we're never even aware of them as they're happening. And so you don't have to have this awareness of like the specific memory that happened in your childhood to where you're like, yep, that's where I developed this people pleasing. That's where, like, clearly it makes so much sense because this memory was so awful. It is far more likely that you don't have any recollection of these experiences, but they're there nonetheless. I'm trying to think of an example to give you. Okay. So of like well-meaning parents. I'm thinking of like high school, like teenage years. I'm just going to use like prom and boyfriends as an example. Okay. Let's say you grew up with really, really great parents and you like got a brand new boyfriend and he invited you to prom. I want to use this example to illustrate how parents can have positive intentions and still quote unquote do the right thing, so to speak, but it still have like residual effects on you. So let's say your parents think it's inappropriate for your boyfriend to come over and like spend the night in your room. Okay. Let's just say, for the sake of the example, that they're right. It's not appropriate for him to spend the night in your room. Okay. However, your brain's not fully developed yet, and you're a teenager, you're a young girl, let's say. Your brain doesn't have the ability to see the logic in their wanting to protect you. Right? That's why they're saying that. They're saying no because they have your best intentions at heart. They're trying to protect you. But as a child, as a young adult, where your brain hasn't fully developed to understand that, your emotional brain, all it's going to notice and feel is, I really, really want this, and my parents don't care about how I feel. Because if they cared about how I feel, they would let me have what I want. And then we grow up to be adults and we're like, of course they would do that. Because as a mom, that's the exact way that I would react. That is beside the point. I really want you to zoom out and see this. As a child, if the intense emotional reaction you have to that is, oh, my parents don't care. Why don't they listen? And this is like how I'm trying to show up as a mom now. I'm always going to get it wrong, but I at least want to be the kind of parent that holds space for my child's emotional experience before I take action or respond or explain why it's not okay or say no or whatever. If that parent has a positive intention, but there was no room, like, nope, no ifs, ands, or buts, Missy, that's just how it's going to be. No back talk. I don't want to hear it. Well, then you are going to feel like you don't have a space to be heard. And sure, maybe your reasons don't make sense. Sure, maybe they're not logical or maybe they're not still the right decision. But the point is, in that moment, you needed someone to hear you and to validate your emotional experience and also make the proper choices to protect you as a child. Does that make sense? Like, there's a difference between parenting and disciplining to protect your child and also having that emotional space held. So if you never experience opportunities for you to voice how you feel, regardless of it being right or wrong, you'll eventually learn it's not safe to express how I feel. Because every time I try to explain my feelings to my parents or whoever, it's met with them shutting me down. It's met with all the reasons why I'm wrong and they're right. It's met with all of this rejection, essentially. And our core desire is to be accepted. And so over time, what happens is we will learn to repress our need and desire to be heard in order to prioritize the attachment. And that's how we end up as grown adults who struggle to speak up for ourselves, who struggle with expressing how we feel, who struggle with letting people in and being vulnerable, because you didn't have the space to do that and have it be met with acceptance or be met with empathy, regardless of it, quote unquote, being right or wrong. That's a big one, is learning how to repress our needs in exchange for validation and acceptance. On the flip side of that, you might have grown up in an environment where you only received praise and validation for doing good things, right? I know that was the environment that I grew up in. I did not receive any attention for having an emotional experience. Now, if I got straight A's, that was a big celebration. That was a big to-do, right? And so I quickly learned, oh, this feels good. This is the positive feedback I want. This is the love I'm looking for and the attention. So how can I do more of these things to get the outcome that I want, which is praise and attention and love? And so that is how we grow up to be adults who are overachievers, perfectionists, and people pleasers, is because we grew up in an environment where that was the only way to receive love and acceptance. So in order to prevent having our children grow up that way, it's really important to love and accept and show praise even in the hard moments, right? Like, yes, you made a mistake, but I'm so proud of you for having the courage to bring it and like admit that shortcoming to me, right? And so like, yes, you made a mistake, but that doesn't mean you're a bad person. There's so many small opportunities as we're growing up where sometimes our parents are going to get it right, sometimes they're going to miss the mark, or again, maybe you grew up and that was just like across the board not happening at all. So if you're only receiving external validations for what you do rather than who you are going to grow up to be someone who still believes that to be true. And so you will be the workaholic, you will be the high earner and the high performer, because that's the only way you're used to feeling loved and validated and recognized. That's why so much of what I talk about here and the work that I've done is around identity work, like where you are finding your worth and your value. And unfortunately, so many of us, in some way or another, we do believe that our value and our identity is tied to what we do. And it is true to a certain extent. However, that is not the value that we carry, right? Like if you were a top performer and then suddenly one day the company you were with completely dissolved, you're still the same exact person who's capable of doing the things you did for that company. Just because you don't have that title anymore or that career or that job rank doesn't mean you don't have value. It's just not being seen. And if you're constantly having to seek the validation or having somebody else or an external entity validate that within you, that's where it becomes a problem, because it's completely dependent upon external factors rather than your own internal knowing of the value that you hold, regardless of what season you are in, regardless of whether you are, quote unquote, proving it or not. And this leads into the next root of people pleasing, which is feeling like you have to be perfect or achieve these impossibly high standards in order to be accepted or valued by others. And this is how we end up as perfectionists, because we're constantly trying to avoid those feelings of not being good enough. And the way that we cope with those feelings of not being good enough is by trying to prevent as little imperfection as possible, and in order to present the most perfect and presentable version of ourselves. And that's because, again, we've had these experiences that have reinforced the belief that that is how you are going to be judged. That is how you are going to be valued and accepted by others. That is how you earn acceptance. That is how you avoid rejection. And so, if you're someone who struggles with vulnerability and letting others in, if you have these solid walls up and you really struggle to let your emotions show, especially if they're vulnerable emotions like crying, ask yourself, what are you afraid of when you think of letting your guard down? If you really dig deep beneath the surface, usually it's tied to, I'm scared that someone will reject me in this state. I'm scared that if I show up as this quote unquote lesser version of myself that doesn't have it all together, that people will think less of me. In my personal experience, in my journey of healing from perfectionism and people pleasing, I've found that the more vulnerable I am and the more I let my imperfections show, the more connection I have with other people. And so it's interesting how there are parts of us that really do believe that we have to be our best self in order to earn the love, when in reality, it's our imperfections and our humanness that connects us to others. And that creates that attachment that our subconscious is so desperate for. And yet we're so incapable of doing the very thing that we want, which is showing up in ways that will create attachment. We're so used to these coping skills that produce the exact opposite result, which is pushing others away, which is isolating and not letting our true, authentic selves show to other people. Another root cause of people pleasing is society's expectations and cultural expectations as well. And this one is very unfortunate that it exists, but it's there and it's true nonetheless, which is, in this day and age, there's what's politically correct and what's politically incorrect, right? And some things are seen as disrespectful or offensive, or in some cultures too. For me personally, I have a lot of cultural trauma because on my mom's side, they use shame as a tool to parent and get results out of their kids. And that's something that I've really had to wrestle with. And it's created this resistance for me embracing that side of my culture because I've had such traumatic cultural experiences with shame, right? Like, respect your elders regardless of whether they do something that doesn't warrant respect. Like, I'm sorry, I don't agree. You need to earn respect. You need to show your character is worthy of respect. It's not just something that you give to someone because they are older than you, right? And so that can be extremely traumatic. God forbid there is like physical, sexual, emotional trauma, and you're still being told to respect this person who is your elder, right? And then there's the whole toxic masculinity that our culture is obsessed with. Like, men need to be strong and men don't cry, don't be seen as weak, and all of these things that completely confuse who we were meant to be. This creates so much conflict within ourselves, and it makes so much sense how we end up as people who are trying to behave in a way that fits the mold or behave in a way that gets us inside of the box of acceptance instead of being able to authentically express and be ourselves and have that acceptance be there nonetheless. Next, I want to talk about the cost of people pleasing. And while this may be a little bit depressing, I think it's important to talk about so that we understand what is at risk here. I love fear setting, which was created by Tim Ferriss, and it's essentially the opposite of goal setting. In a nutshell, it's, if you don't take action, what will you lose? Right? Like, goal setting is like, if you take action, here's what you'll gain. But if you don't change, what will you lose? I think that exploring the cost of people pleasing and how people pleasing is having a negative impact on your life, is preventing you from having these connections and so on and so forth. It creates that motivator and that self-awareness to like, okay, these are the cons of me staying the same and me not healing from this. And it's not to create more shame of like, gosh, why can't you get it together and stop people pleasing? Look at all these things you suck at. Okay, that's not the point. Been there, done that, sent the postcard, got the t-shirt. This is more so just to develop self-awareness. And some of these things maybe you're already aware of. You're like, yep, I know. Yep, I get it. But maybe you're like, oh my gosh, I've never thought of it that way before. Regardless of where you fall on the spectrum, let's just review some things, shall we? So, when we're people pleasing, we become so attuned to other people's needs. It's because we've learned that that is how we are going to be acceptance, right? Well, if I can control someone else's perception of me, then I can control how they perceive me, which means I think that I'm in control of being accepted and feeling good. Really, when we are people pleasing, it is a manipulation. We're manipulating someone else's perception of us to avoid rejection and earn acceptance. The cost of doing this, though, is negating our own needs. We become so in tune with everybody else and so aware. Well, if I do this, then they'll react this way. And I don't want them to react this way, so let me show up in this way. Everybody else's needs and desires come before our own. Or maybe it's gotten to the point where you're not even aware of what your needs are anymore because it's not even something that you're used to giving any sort of thought or attention to. So with people pleasing, you've become disconnected with yourself, with your needs, your wants, and your desires. Not to mention it's exhausting. Am I right? Gosh, how many times have you stayed up at night replaying a conversation in your head or over analyzing every single action and detail and word that was spoken? The cost of that is emotional and physical exhaustion. You're going to feel that heavy burden and you're constantly going to be running on E, and nobody likes to be operating from that place, right? In addition to that, resentment. Gosh, so what happens when we say yes to people and things that we don't want to do? Because we don't feel confident enough to express how we really feel, by default, it's going to create resentment. And that's unfortunate because it's resentment that is caused on our part that could be avoided. And so, as much as it is difficult to speak up for yourself and to say no and to feel that the residual guilt that may come from that, it's also just as hard to feel that resentment start to build around your life. So, as much as you think that you are avoiding something bad, like, well, I'm going to say yes so I don't feel guilty. Have you taken time to pause and reframe that to say, I am going to say no so that I don't feel resentment? Because oftentimes that guilt is the number one motivator for behaving that way. So if you can now develop that awareness and remind yourself, oh yeah, if I say yes to this, there is a very high likelihood that I will be resentful of having to do this, that I will develop resentment for this person constantly asking me things that I don't want to do. It's not because they're asking you, it's because you don't have the ability to speak up for yourself. It's because you're not able to communicate your needs and your requests. That is what is causing the resentment. It's not on them, it's on you. And I hope that feels empowering because you have the ability to mitigate that resentment, which is empowering. That's good. That means that you have the ability to create positive change in your life. Another huge cost of people pleasing is your self-esteem and your self-worth. How many times have you felt guilty for saying no? And then as soon as you say no, you start to shame yourself for feeling guilty for saying no. It's like a double whammy of like, I wish I was stronger so that I could actually stick up for myself. That's going to create so much self-hatred and such self-shame and low self-worth. However, when you learn how to advocate for yourself, when you learn how to set healthy boundaries, what's going to happen is you'll start to trust yourself more. Gosh, wouldn't that feel nice, right? To be able to show up for yourself, to be able to say, I trust that no matter what happens, that I have the ability to advocate for my own needs and desires. As someone who 100% had zero skills, zero ability to advocate for myself, I was a full-on people pleaser. I didn't understand boundaries in the slightest. I didn't know what they were, let alone how to communicate them. All I knew was that my life was full of this guilt, resentment, anxiety, all the things that we've been talking about. And I just have to say, over the past 2 to 3 years of really actively trying to work through this stuff in therapy and my own inner work, it has made a world of difference in how I feel about myself, simply in the fact that I have more confidence in my own ability to take care of myself, especially as mothers and as women. Of course, we need to advocate for our children and be nurturers of the people who rely on us. But what about that inner child within you? when was the last time that you advocated for yourself, and how would that feel? I guess what I'm trying to get at is if you are someone who struggles with self-esteem, low confidence, and low self-worth, healing this part of you, your people-pleasing tendencies, will have a drastic effect in how you feel about yourself, and it will make a huge difference in that area for you. Another cost, and this is a sad one for me, is losing touch with your own identity, losing touch with your own sense of self, who you are. What do you actually believe? No, what do you actually think? I get what is politically correct or won't offend someone or won't piss someone else off by you saying it. But like, really, what do you want to say? What do you actually think? When we are so used to living in people-pleasing mode, oftentimes we have no idea what it is that we really want and what we really value and what we really need. I talked about this a lot in previous episodes. When I ended my marriage, it was because I finally became aware that our marriage was not built on a foundation of core values. It was built on a foundation of needing and wanting him to choose me so I would feel loved and accepted. And when I developed that self-awareness and I started to do work about like, okay, well then if that's the case, what do I actually value in a relationship? And I actually took the time to consider what I need and value in a relationship. It was life-changing. It was like all these light bulbs were going off. Well, no wonder this marriage hasn't been what I need it to be. And it's unfortunate because so often we're driven by these fears of being disliked, fears of abandonment. That's a huge one. Fears of being alone. And those fears are so big and they're so scary that they take the driver's seat. And our values and our needs and all of these things, our sense of identity gets buried by all of that. And we don't discover who we really are, what we stand for, what we value. And that's a huge loss. People pleasers are constantly trying to make everybody else happy. The way that we've learned to do this is by being what we think other people want us to be, right? And that is exhausting. We talked about that already. But another unfortunate cost of doing this is we start to hide our authentic selves. We start to show up as a version of ourselves that isn't true. It's not truly in alignment with who we are. It's not how we truly feel. It's like this mask that we're presenting to other people. And what happens when we live our life with a mask on? We have no real authentic connection. It's like we never let anyone see who we really are. And when we're not doing that, we're not living an authentic life, which means that even if you are people pleasing because you want to be seen and accepted, but then the sad thing is we never can be fully accepted because we're not showing up as our true selves. The only way we can truly be accepted is if we let our true authentic selves show, and the other person then has the ability to say, yes, I see you. I see the real you and I accept you. And it's sad because we just live this life full of surface level interactions. We wake up in a midlife crisis wondering why we have no connection, why something feels missing. Oftentimes it's linked to this. So the consequences are very, very real. It's not just, I care about what people think. No, it's a lot deeper than that. Hopefully by now you've started to identify where some of this originated from. We talked about what the costs are and you're like, okay, no more of that, Monica. I get it. Let's do something about this. Well, what the heck can you do about it? Let's talk about that. The very first step in healing from people pleasing is developing self-awareness. And that's because you can't change if you don't see or understand where the problem is, right? I always use the AA analogy. Like alcoholics can't start to get sober if they don't think they're alcoholics. So if you have this belief that, oh, well, that's just how I am. I was born that way. There's no real reason. I didn't have trauma. Well, then you're not going to be able to take accountability to do anything about it. You're not going to be able to make that change in your life. So that's step number one, is developing self-awareness. And if you made it this far into the episode, I have so much confidence that you've already started to develop that awareness. And maybe as I've gone through some of these examples, you're like, yes, that's me. And the good news is that means you are already on your way to healing from your people-pleasing tendencies. The next step is to practice, practice, practice. In the beginning of this episode, I talked about how important it is to develop the skills that you need to be able to redirect your thoughts, to be able to rewrite these narratives and these beliefs and all these things. And it's a lot that's involved in it. And so it's not going to happen overnight. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot to sort through, a lot to work through, a lot of feelings that are going to come up. And it's not going to stick right away, right? Like, you don't hone a craft or a skill. You don't become an Olympic gold medalist by doing it one time. And something that makes it easier to learn these things and to practice is seeking accountability from other people who are as committed to making the same change in their life as you. And I'm sure you're very well familiar with how it feels to be around others who don't believe in the same things that you do, right? Let's say you are, I don't know, trying to cut out gluten or dairy for like inflammation issues or like health reasons, and you're constantly around people who are trying to influence you to eat fast food. Well, it's going to be a lot harder to do that. And so it's just important to seek out other like-minded people, which is exactly why I created the Choosing to Heal community, because it is really rare to find other people who are on this path of inner healing. And fortunately, it is more common to live in a state of unconscious reacting all the time, where we don't take inventory and we numb and we cope in all of these different unhealthy ways that we're not even aware of. And it's a lot harder and it's a lot braver to lean in to this hard stuff. So if you're someone who feels like you don't have a single person in your life, or it's very few and far between people to talk to about this kind of stuff, do you have a friend you could send this podcast episode to and be like, girl, listen to this? And then they respond and they're like, oh my gosh, that's me. Yes, I blah, blah, blah. If you don't have someone like that, I highly recommend you look into our Choosing to Heal community. You're going to meet your people inside of our community that listen to this podcast, who are choosing to heal and who are committed to the same things as you. So when you join my email list, one of the first questions I ask is, what area do you need the most encouragement in? Like, what area are you struggling with most? And hands down, by far, the most common response has been people pleasing. All over social media, my DMs, that seems to be the area that we're all struggling with the most. And because of that, I am thrilled to announce that I've created a free 7-day people-pleasing challenge. And this is going to give you homework, accountability, and actionable steps that you can take each day, all of which are specifically designed to help you take baby steps towards healing your people-pleasing tendencies. Something I'm a huge advocate for is taking these really big concepts like people-pleasing and breaking them down into tangible, actionable steps so you actually know what to do to create change in your life. That's what we do in the Choosing to Heal community. And that's exactly what is going to happen when you join the 7-day people-pleasing challenge as well. This challenge is for you if you are ready to stop people-pleasing and start living your life on your own terms. Each day is going to have education so you can understand yourself better. It's going to have actionable steps for you to take. So it goes from just understanding in your head to real life application. It also has journal prompts for you to really dive deep into your own people-pleasing behaviors. And it's also going to have that built-in accountability, which is usually the piece that is missing when we're trying to make change. Something's not sticking. I usually ask, okay, what kind of accountability do you have in place? How are you showing up to someone else? How are you staying accountable? The 7 topics we're going to be exploring in this challenge are the cost of people-pleasing, taking inventory of your people-pleasing behaviors, so like how it is showing up in your life, understanding the root of people pleasing. So we covered some general examples here, but we're going to make it specific to you and how to address them. Identifying your fears. So learning about the fears that are driving your people pleasing behaviors. Getting clear on what and who is important. So clarifying your values, your priorities, and learning how to make decisions that align with them. Because often when we're people pleasing, we're making choices that aren't aligned with what is most important in our life. So we want to get really clear on that. We're going to practice setting boundaries and communicating. So this is like people pleasing 101. You don't want to miss that day, right? Like from what to say. What is a boundary actually defined? What's the formula for creating a boundary? How to stay accountable to yourself when setting boundaries, and how to communicate your needs effectively. And last but not least, we're going to learn how to practice self-compassion and acceptance, and how to cultivate a more authentic and fulfilling life, how to learn how to trust yourself, how to show up more confidently for yourself. Because the truth is, we can learn how to say no. We can understand the root of our people pleasing, but if we don't learn how to accept ourselves and we don't learn how to show up authentically, it's all going to be for nothing. That is the whole goal of healing, is to be able to show up in a way that is aligned with our true, most authentic self. So if you are ready to go on a journey from being a people pleaser to a more confident, boundaried, authentic version of yourself, head to the show notes of this episode for a link to join this free people pleasing challenge.